Hello and welcome to another episode of Teacher Talk. In this episode, we will conclude the presentation given by Professor Khalil Osiris, the founder and designer of COCMP, a cognitive behavioral change model for teachers, learners, and parents. Previously, we spoke about the fact that all behavior is a consequence of thoughts and values. Professor Osiris encourages teachers to keep an open mind about the values instilled in the children, which then reflect within a classroom environment. The advice given may help you to provide positive feedback, which will lead to more positive behavior.
Be respectful. When we talk about being respectful, we have to define it in terms of concrete behavior. We have to give examples of what being respectful looks like. What does it look like in a school environment when we say be respectful? If you're teaching the value from the beginning as a core expectation school-wide, then children come into the school culture and the school environment with an expectation that these values are consistently demonstrated, are consistently exercised and activated throughout the school, whatever classroom they go into. But if you have on the other hand, a teacher who is disrespectful to learners, if you have an example of a teacher who is disrespectful to other teachers, if you have an example of teachers who are disrespectful to the administration, then the value of being respectful isn't being activated and consistently supported in your school. And it's going to be very difficult for you to get uniformity of action on the part of those learners. Because let me just share this with you. The only way to get unity of action is if you have unity of thought. The only way for you to ever achieve unity of action in any situation is if you first develop unity of thought. And unity of thought simply means that you have shared values, shared expectations around the work that you're doing collectively. This second value of be responsible. You know how you want children to do the homework assignments that you give them and do all the other things in the classroom and time on task spent very well? Being responsible. You define it in terms of concrete behavior. Do not leave it to chance. You do not want children to be unclear about what being responsible looks like on a daily basis in their classroom. So you define what being responsible looks like. And thirdly, be safe. Don't you want children to be safe in the school? Don't you want your school to be a safe place for them to learn? So these core values, and let me just tell you, you can take just these core values, put them up in your school, test it in your classroom. You don't even have to go school-wide because some of you don't have the power to implement it school-wide. You only can do what you have control over in your classroom. And I'm sharing with you that if in your classroom, when you go back to school next week, to your school, you place in your classroom 3 core values for your class. Be respectful, be responsible, be safe. I promise you by the end of the week, every learner in your class will have a concrete understanding of what it means to be respectful. And when they're not respectful, you have a greater opportunity, you have a greater kind of foundation, stronger foundation for you to then call them back to respectful behavior. But if you haven't set this in motion as a core expectation up front, it's very difficult for you out of the clear blue, because you value being respectful, to expect them to be respectful. You have no frame of reference for agreed or mutually shared values. Secondly, on being responsible, guess what? If you put this in your class, the children will tell you themselves what it means to be responsible. All you have to ask them, what do you think being responsible is? They will tell you. And being safe. Now here's the deal. Notice that all of these are affirmations, they're positives. What we typically see in schools that have zero tolerance policies and emphasize what we call consequences, we see negative affirmations. In other words, don't talk, don't curse, don't fight, don't bully anyone. Really. As long as you tell people, don't, they're going to do. It's what you encounter it. As a parent, I said, don't stay up all night listening to that crazy music and then expect me to be nice in the morning when you get up or don't get up. No, you're starting from the wrong place. Basically, starting from the negatives is starting from what we call a deficit model. In other words, you start from what you think children lack rather than what they have. Starting from what they have, or the positives, is called a strength-based approach. And the purpose of a strength-based approach is to acknowledge and celebrate what they already have and the genius is already present before they even came to you. And we know that it's present because they arrived at your doorstep or they arrived at your classroom. So there's genius there regardless of whether or not you see it yet. And that's why we say we do not teach to where the child is, we teach to their potential. We are always teaching to the potential. That's why we don't get discouraged by the fact that we don't see it manifest yet, because it's potential we're teaching to. Just think in your own lives. Think as adults, as grown adults now. Haven't you done some things, good things I'm talking about, that you've accomplished, good things you've accomplished, that even you didn't know that you would do? Of course, because it was in you. You didn't know it at the time, but it was in you. That's potential. And I'm telling you, as difficult as a child may be while they're working in your classroom or creating problems in your classroom, there's a potential there for them to be greater than however they're behaving in that moment. But here's what we have to tell you. Given, you understand the values part of it. It's very clear, right? Given that we know that's the case, there's a very simple process that we use for helping educators understand why young people behave the way they do. We say that all behavior, wherever you go in the world, I don't care if it's China, Indonesia, America, or South Africa, all behavior is a consequence of thoughts and values. All behavior is a consequence of thoughts and values. So if a child is acting out in your classroom, you need to know that it's because of the way they're thinking. So if you, as a teacher, focus on punishing the behavior and you never address the thoughts and values that's producing the behavior, you will never sustain the changes that you want in that child. Yeah, you can punish them that day. You can kick them out of your class. You can even expel them from school. But you will never change the behavior simply by doing that. It's like children who get into trouble. Children who are actually already responsible for committing crimes. And your job is to work with them and help them turn their lives around. Okay, so if you intend to do that successfully, if it's your intention to change that kind of behavior around, then you need a way of doing it. You need a process that you can use that you turn over to them, that they become more effective in using for themselves. So this model is what I call the positive change model. It's just like this. Okay, at the top of the positive change model is what we call thoughts and values, and it's all positive. Remember I told you about those values, and I started with love, and I say here's what it looks like concretely. So if we're teaching to a value, love or respectful, being respectful, and it's positive from the start, then what would change this positive behavior? What is this positive thought or value? What would change it most dramatically? What we know from the research, it's conditions or circumstances. A condition or circumstances like your classroom or the situation at home or whatever they're going through in their life. There's going to always be a condition or a situation in your life that will challenge you on the basis of what you're thinking and what your values are. And any time that you find yourself challenged or in a situation, it will lead to you acting a certain way. So the next step here is actions. Conditions demand actions. If you wake up in the morning and you have no money, and you have bills, and you have no food, and your children are hungry, you're going to act. You're going to do something to feed your children. That's the expectation that you have for yourself. But it's a universal expectation for any person that finds himself in a situation where action must be taken. Now the question is your action positive or negative? If your action is negative, it's because you have engaged in thoughts and values that reflect a negative kind of behavior.
The professor gave an example to illustrate this point of distortion, a situation where you felt that your superior was less qualified. Where would this idea stem from? The answer? From you. He reveals that you are the source of your information. Let's hear where this discourse could be initiating from and how to alter this cause of thinking.
Yeah. You look at them and you say, no, I watched them. Really, you did? How long did you watch them? No, I watched them when they were hired. You watched them get hired, and well, I've been watching them now for a while, and I just see they don't do anything right. Okay, so you're judge and juror. You know now that you're more qualified than them because you have watched them enough to make that determination. Okay, that's fine, but we're not going to argue with that. We're going to say, let's just assume you're correct. If you stay in a state of thinking that the reason that they're in that position and you're not is because perhaps they've been promoted, friends, connections. Wait a minute, hold on, wait a minute. We're saying friends and connect. What about BEE? Oh, nobody said that, huh? Well, I'm not politically correct. I don't have to, because I'm not from South Africa, so you have to forgive me if I say some things that seem politically incorrect. Okay, so I'm saying that do you think BEE might be a reason that someone could be in a position where they're not as qualified as someone else who's been there? One of the reasons. Okay. And if you keep dwelling on that, can you see how it would lead to a distortion? How it would lead to negative kinds of feelings and then ultimately negative actions? So if you find yourself in the distortion based on your own definition of how you're acting, then you have to challenge it. You got to challenge it. And the most effective way to challenge it is for you to determine whether or not you want to act out of the conditions or out of, which is external. Remember I talked about external locus of control, internal locus of control. The conditions are always your external locus of control. Always. In other words, if I ask you why you stole somebody's money, and you tell me it's because I was poor and I grew up in Alexandria, you're telling me your reason for being a thief is because of your environment. Let me tell you the problem with that. I'm just going to tell you the problem with it. First, sure. We can do both because the principle applies across the board. See, there's some things that are universally correct regardless of the culture, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of your economic standing. The majority of the world is poor, but they're not thieves. Please try to understand what I'm saying. The majority of the world, in other words, there's more poor people than there are rich people. That's why I use the example of the poor. Typically, when we hear about rich people stealing, really? That's what I'm saying. We can hear about it, but that's okay. We know that ultimately, here's what they say, oh, I'll pay for it now. The poor person tells, oh, I don't have anything to pay for it. But if your conditions is the reason for your actions, then you are operating in a way that's out of control. So what we're saying is, by moving the process up here, we're encouraging you to identify the internal source of your actions so that when we talk about changing it, we have a basis and a framework for what to work on to change it. If, on the other hand, we simply say we're going to punish you and the consequence for acting this way is that we expel you from school, here's the problem with consequences. Consequences don't teach skills. I want to repeat this. You can send a person to jail and they serve 5 or 10 years and come out and in 3 hours be back to stealing and selling drugs and getting high? Have you seen, any of you know anybody that's been to jail? Let me see if you know somebody's been to jail. Let me raise your hands, please. No, if you know somebody's been to jail, raise your hand. If you have someone in your family that's been to jail, raise your hand. Okay. And do you know anybody that went to jail and then got out and then went back to jail? You know that too, right? Don't you, isn't it kind of curious to say, if you hated it so much in there, why would you turn around and go back to it? They call that return recidivism. That's the actual term for it. The definition of it is recidivate. They return to a situation they didn't like. But now most of you can't understand recidivism, right? Why does a person do? So let me just explain why that happens. Because if a child is acting out in ways that are inappropriate, when the older they get, the more criminal that inappropriate behavior becomes. So much so that we know the children who perform lowest or poorest in schools are the ones most likely to end up in jail. That's what the research says. So here, let me give you an example of recidivism that you might be able to better understand at a more practical level. Yes, this word is a very important word for you to learn. So I'm going to use this word. Okay. Recidivism. Recidivism. Now let me give you a practical example. Who here has had a job that you didn't like? Ever had a job you didn't like? Oh, I see hands go. I see some people trying to put their feet in the air. Okay. And did you complain about that job while you were at work? Any of you ever took the time to complain about your job while you were at work? I mean, even beyond that, have you ever used any of your airtime with some of your friends while you were leaving work to talk about how much you don't like your job? And how your supervisor is so incompetent? And how you know so much better than them? Have you ever had that experience? Wait a minute. Well, wait a minute. You are actually spending your airtime? Wait a minute. And then at the end of the month, here's what happens. They pay you. Like you get paid at the end of the month. Like about right now, you get paid. And guess what happens? On the Monday morning after you get paid, you go back to the same job. Wait a minute. The job that you said you hate, that you spent your airtime complaining about, you recidivated. That's recidivism. The thing you said you hated all month long, you complained, you did everything under the sun. This is wrong, the people are incompetent. None of this makes sense to me, and then you get your paycheck. In other words, you got your paper saying you were free. You're free. It's no longer apartheid, you're free. Wait a minute, you're free, but you go back. And guess what? And when we ask, why did you go back? You know what typically you say? It's, I need the money. But here's the problem with that kind of thinking. At the end of the month, when you get paid, you have more bills than you have paycheck. So the amount of money that you're making isn't even enough to pay all your bills. So how is it that it's for the money? Because guess what? Here's what every person in prison would tell you. I ask them, why are you in prison? Because I wanted some money. You sound like the teachers. You sound like the teachers. You sound like the teachers we were talking with. You wanted some money. Oh, are you a teacher? Oh, no. Oh, you wanted, okay, so were you broke when you committed the crime? Yes. Were you broke when you went to trial? Yes. Are you broke now? Yes. Will you be broke when you leave? Yes. That would be triple yes. So wait a minute. If you're broke before you arrive and you're going to be broke when you leave, what's changed? Nothing's changed. So what's the likelihood that you won't return? If that's your reasoning, and all we're talking about with doing this is thinking. All we're talking about is your thinking. That's all we're talking about. Because the only thing that changes behavior is thinking. That's the only thing that will ever change your behavior is the way you think. It's not learning maths. Learning maths will not change your behavior. I'm sorry, folks, if you're a maths teacher, but it will not change your behavior. Learning English, as nice as it is, will not change your behavior. So if you understand what changes behavior, then it's thoughts and values. So here's what we say about that. If you really want to be effective in changing behavior in the school that you're working, in your classroom, you have to begin to understand how your learners think. Not just what they do, but how they think. If you want to change the behavior of your child, if you have a child, who here has been telling their child to get up on time for more than a year? Anybody had anything you've been trying to do with your child for more than a year and they seem not to respond well, even today? Okay. Well, there's a way to address that. It means you're going to have to make some changes. That old script you have of cursing them out, you might have to let that go for a while. It's like my mother, when I was a little boy, my mother she could give me a look and make me just stop in my tracks. And I remember I went away and came back, and guess what? I remember I was about 14 or 15 and she tried to give me that same look. I said, Mom, stop. You know how parents would try to continue that long past its usefulness? I'm like, Mom, that doesn't work anymore. You can look mean at me, but I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing. So it doesn't work. You have to get inside the thinking.
The professor shares an intimate part of his life. He spent time focusing on why he went to prison. After laying the blame on others, he came to the revelation that he did it to himself. He had to look at the source of his imprisonment. Let's watch this internal locus control play to effect.
I was in prison. I personally was in prison. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. How long you think? 20 years. I was in prison for 20 years. Not one or two, not three or four. So when we talk about that problem child, and the first time I went to prison, I was 17 years old. Let me just explain it. Because I want you to understand this in context and why we use it the way that we do. I was 17 years old. Now, I had always been top academics, top athlete, totally the best child in my family. Yeah, I know. You know how parents tell you they don't have favorites? I was the favorite. I was born first, so I was the firstborn, and I was the favorite. Now, some of you know what it means to be the favorite in your family, right? Because some of you are 40 years old still talking about, well, you know, she liked you better when we was growing up. You know, some of you still have those scripts of who was liked the best. But here's what happened. At 17, I committed a robbery of a drugstore. I did not use drugs. It was for a drug deal. I saw it as a way to make some money. At 17, my buddies were caught. I was later caught because they told, like all good thieves and criminals do. Do not be fooled by this lie about a code of honor. They tell. Just like if someone came to your school and asked you certain questions, there's some of you who would not hesitate to tell. So they told, and I went to prison. I served 5 years. 5 years, from 17 to 22. When I got out at 22, I was worse than when I went in. I was worse. The thoughts and values that led me to prison were more entrenched, the distortions were more entrenched than when I was never exposed to prison. So within 3 years after my release, and when I got out, guess what I did? I went right back to crime. The same behavior that as a young man was just inappropriate in the classroom became criminal once I became an adult. See, there's a point at which it stops simply being inappropriate and it becomes criminal. It becomes antisocial. So for 3 years, I organized individuals into a syndicate set up corporate and business accounts, floated those accounts with checks that were taken in robberies, traveler's checks. It was very deliberate. I did not go to prison for racism. I did not go to prison for injustice. I did not go to prison because of misconduct of prosecutors. I went to prison because I made choices that were criminal. And the consequence was my arrest. So the second time I remember, I'm 25 years old. I have 2 children now because I didn't tell you, but at 17, I was a teenage father. So during the 3 years that I was out, I had another child, another son. Now I have 2 sons. I'm sitting in prison. I'm 25 years old, and my children are asked, Pops, Dad, when are you coming home? I left them without a father. My choices resulted in them being without a father. And what the research shows, children who have an incarcerated parent, a parent who goes to prison, or a family member are more likely to end up there themselves than those who don't. There's research to support that. So when I finally got there the second time, guess what? There was no one else to blame. I decided that I was going to take responsibility for being there, but I first needed to know, why am I here? Like, how did I get here? If I did it to me, I can undo it. How do I undo it? I have to look at the source of my imprisonment. I have to look at the source of my own incarceration. And that source was not a system. It wasn't a condition. It wasn't anything external to myself. It wasn't because of external factors. There was an internal factor, an internal locus of control that determined whether or not I could get out. Once I figured that out, my whole life changed. So they were offering education in prison. Now, isn't this amazing? Children who don't learn in traditional classrooms, you lock them up, they go to school in jail, and they perform at upper levels. The child who wouldn't cooperate in your class graduates with honors in prison. Isn't that a little shocking? So here it is, in prisons, they're having a greater commitment to education than when they were in the community. So you know what? They were debating in Massachusetts, in America, where I was in prison. Would education impact the likelihood of a person staying out when they were released from prison? In other words, would getting an education actually reduce this word right here? Remember this word? Remember this word? Recidivism. Would education reduce the rate of returning to prison if we gave it to those who were in prison? Kind of like the 35,000 that received remission here in South Africa. Those individuals who were just let off the road, okay. No education, no training, you just let a bunch of people out, you release them to the community. As high as the crime rate is in South Africa, people's homes being invaded, you release 35,000 with nothing. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to go right back. They're going to return. That word again keeps coming up, recidivism. And many of them are already back. But here's what I'm saying. Here's what I want you to know. When I took the opportunity to get this education, it changed my life. But the reason why it changed my life is because I recognized that I was responsible for doing something with it. I personally was responsible. So I created 2 rules in prison for myself, which are really applicable in a classroom. Here's rule number 1. Don't break the rules. Think about this. Now, can you imagine a prisoner telling some other prisoners, don't break the rules? Do you know what guys would say to me in prison? They say, man, what are you talking about? You, the biggest lawbreaker of all, are now talking about don't break the rules. I said, yeah. I said, you know why? Because all of the rules are based on don'ts. Don't rob anyone. Don't stab anyone. Don't rape anyone. Don't murder anyone. Don't steal from anyone. You mean you need a gun? You need a gun to tell me not to rape anybody? You need a gun to tell me not to rob anybody? You need actually to put armed guards around me to tell me not to steal from anyone? Let me tell you something. By not breaking the rules, basically what we said to ourselves is that the rules are based on an assumption that we will act like animals. It was all don'ts. That's why I say in your classroom, one of the most effective things you can do is talk about what to do rather than what not to do. You don't start from a negative assumption. Now, if you understand that part of it, then the second part was I made a commitment, turn the cell into a classroom and the prison into a university. In other words, turn the cell into a classroom and the prison into a university. In other words, no matter what was going on in the prison, I decided that I was going to turn it into a positive experience. That it would no longer be a negative experience for me. I have a reason for telling you this prison part because I need you to know where many of those children will end up who you don't reach. The ones who you see, you know, in South Africa, 80% don't matric. 80%. And then we have the standards with you. Wait a minute, you went from 50% pass rate. You could pass if you get just 50%, right? You know what it is now? What is it, like 30 something? 28%? How could that make any sense? In other words, the next time you think about going to the doctor, I just want you to think about it. The next time you personally think about going to the doctor's pass rate is 28, 40%. Do you feel comfortable with pancreatic cancer? You feel comfortable taking your mother in there to the doctor who says, hey, we needed 32%. That's much better than the township schools. We needed 32%. Is that acceptable? No. No, it's not. But if we continue to think that way, guess what we'll continue to produce? Yes, we'll produce the same thing. So let me take you to the far end of this. I told you about the other side of this. Got some people going. Let me bring you down to the close of this, because I want you to get this last piece of it. We said moral reasoning. I really want you to understand this. There are 3 levels of moral reasoning. And the 3 levels, one is pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Pre-conventional is me, my, I. Conventional is everybody else is doing it, and post-conventional, it's in the best interest or the greater good of everybody. If you have learners in your classroom who can only think about themselves because that's the level of moral reasoning they're operating from, like they only do it if it's something in it for them, and you're trying to encourage them to do it for the greater good of the class, you're setting them up for failure. Pre-conventional moral reasoning is about self-interest. And don't think that's just children, that's individuals, like the individuals you say who suck up to the administration, as you called it. They're looking at what's in it for them. They're operating from pre-conventional moral reasoning. And if you have schools that are being run with values that reflect me, my, I, what's in it for me, and then you're expecting children to cooperate and act in ways that are above pre-conventional moral reasoning, you're setting them up for failure, and it's a contradiction of terms. So you have to ask yourself, am I operating from the level of it's what is in it for me, or it's because everybody's doing it? And if everybody's doing it, is that the reason for you to do it? All your schools in I went to a school, one of the teachers was drinking on the premises. And it was acted just as normal. In other words, that behavior had been so normalized that no one else saw it as a problem. I felt like the dummy for even saying something. And you know what he told me? You must be new. You must be new. You see, here's what he said. He said, see, my culture. I said, oh, I don't have any culture? No. He said, my culture, we can do this. It's been so normalized that you are now talking about drinking in school as a cultural kind of comment. Do you really want me to believe that? And now you are upset because the boys in your school, guess what they do? They don't respect you. They don't respect you. So moral reasoning is important because you need to know why. And lastly, let me just close with this, because there's a lot of more information, and hopefully we'll have a chance through the teacher to get more information to you. But let me just close with this little story. I told you I ended up getting my master's and bachelor's and master's degree from Boston University, Ivy League school in America, while I was in prison. I went on to write several books, become a research professor. I now write curriculum, and we use the curriculum to teach teachers. We actually educate educators. Imagine that. The little boy who was the problem, who created all the challenges for the teachers, ended up being the one who teaches teachers. Because there was something called potential that was present even then. And if someone would teach to the potential, and there were some teachers who saw it. But you know how old I was when I got out of prison? I was 40 years old when I got out of prison. I'm 53 now. I was 40. How many of your children, they're not even near that. If you have written them off at 15, you would never see them become someone like me. So I would just encourage you that no matter how bad they may seem at that moment that you encounter them, because you don't know what God has in store for their life, because you are not God. You're a teacher, but you're not God. I would encourage you to teach to their potential rather than teaching to where they are. I'm proof of it. And lastly, let me just say this. There's a little story. There was a boy named Simpiwe. And Simpiwe had a friend named Bongani. And Bongani followed Simpiwe everywhere he went. Simpiwe was an angry child. His father had been arrested. He was part of the movement and all those things. And he talked about the stories and all of that. But he had since left the movement and he became a criminal. You know, there's one thing to say you're in prison because you were in the movement and apartheid. Well, apartheid's over. You're in prison now. You're in prison because you committed a crime. Okay, so let's just get that clear. And Simpiwe's father, though he had been in the movement, had now become a criminal. And Bongani's father was a hard-working, industrious man. He was an entrepreneur. And every time Simpiwe would go over to this house, he would get angry because really what he was saying is he was hurt that his own father wasn't there. And so there was an old man named Thabo who lived in the community. And everybody knew Thabo because Thabo had gotten into a lot of trouble himself, had drank, had used drugs, but he changed his life, and now he was an upstanding member of the community. But Thabo had this thing where he'd go to all the boys in the community, and guess what he tried to do? He tried to encourage them to do the right thing. But Simpiwe hated him most of all. And guess what? He loved Simpiwe most of all. And so Simpiwe told Bongani, he said, you know what, I'm gonna trick old man Thabo. Uncle Thabo, I'm gonna trick him. And Bongani's like, how you gonna trick Uncle? He's the smartest one in the community. How you gonna trick him? Don't you see, Bongani, that's why you follow me. He says, I'm gonna catch a bird and then I'm gonna show it to Uncle. If you've never tried to catch a bird, you have no idea how hard this is. You have no idea. It is very hard to catch a bird. If you don't believe me, try it. Okay, so Simpiwe sets a trap. He gets a little noose, he gets some bread, he gets some other stuff out there. All these birds start flocking. Simpiwe waited 3 days for these birds to keep coming. 3 days he was patient. Bongani was like, oh, said, Pee Wee, how you gonna catch? He said, just wait. The third day, all the birds flew in when he put the food out, and he snatched the net, string of the net, pulled it and ran, and he got the bird. He pulled it all the way, he has the bird now. The bird's just flapping. And wouldn't you know, Uncle's over at the church. Because you know Uncle goes to church now. He's reformed. He sees him. And he tells Bangani, he said, we're going over there. I got the bird. We're going over there. I'm going to ask Uncle, what do I have in my hands? And Uncle, he gets up to Uncle, he said, well, Uncle, what do I have in my hands? And Uncle looks at him. He hears the bird flapping. He hears the chirp. He just keeps walking. He said, no, no, no. Don't try to diss me. Don't disrespect me. You said be respectful. What do I have in my hands? He looks at him. He says, Pee Wee, you have a bird in your hands. Yeah, I got a bird. He looks back at Bangani. He says, now I'm going to ask him, is it dead or alive? And Bangani's listening. He said, and Bangani gets it. He said, oh, if he says it's dead, you're going to let it live. If he says it's alive, you're going to crush it. He got Uncle. Bangani said, man, you got Uncle, whatever he says. Pee Wee said, that's why you follow me, Bangani. That's why you follow me. I'm going to show you Uncle ain't as smart as he thinks he is. He says, Uncle, is it dead or alive? Uncle looks at Pee Wee. He says, son, it's in your hands. It's in your hands. What I'm going to say to you as educators, as teachers, as parents, as elders in your community, whatever the problem is that you're facing, it's in your hands. Whatever you would like to see changed, it's in your hands. Whatever the reason is for you to be a 4 or a 2 or a 6 on a scale of 1 to 10 when you could choose to be a 10, it's in your hands. When I'm asked what number am I have no question about what that number is. I'm a 10. And the reason that I'm a 10 is because I choose to exercise my power to be a 10 every day. No matter what is going on around me, I can choose to exercise my power to operate from an internal locus of control rather than an external locus of control.
The session ended leaving the audience with many questions. Here are some of the comments Professor Osiris gave.
If we all have the same content, then it's an issue of process. What is the process that we use to deliver the education that we say is important? What I'm going to suggest is that our process needs to be questioned.
The clarification given on this point of focus is that if we all have the same content, the same books, and tests are done by all, then if a third of the class performs well, but 2/3 perform poorly, then the question educators must ask is, why? This is where the issue of process of how the content is delivered needs to be looked at.
In South Africa, you have great content. Every year, the South African Department of Education comes up with some new plan. Every year. I'm saying, it's a new plan, and guess what? They spend millions of rands writing these big books about how great the new, it's good, it's really good. No. The last one with the last minister was horrible. The last minister, we'll strike their name from the record. What we have now is the best. Now, here's the problem with that. You're not getting consistent results. So you have teachers now every year thinking, oh, it's going to be some new stuff when we arrive anyway, so what's the point? So content and process. If you understand content and process, you can go to any classroom and determine how to help learners achieve academically and behaviorally better if you understand content and process. Because now what becomes at issue is, how am I teaching the content? And is the way that I'm teaching the content reaching all of the learners? And that's what's not happening consistently. Some teachers do really good at process levels. Other teachers are really good with content. You know, they'll tell you all day long. You got teachers who will sit up in the classroom and you will think they're Einstein. The children come in the classroom and the teacher is there like he or she is Einstein. Well, of course you look like Einstein. You got the teacher's book. You got all the answers in the book. And you've been teaching it for 20 years. Of course. Now let me take you outside of this subject that you're familiar with. Let me ask you about epistemology. Let me have a conversation with you about epistemology. And some of you say, epistemology, yeah. How do you know what you know? That's epistemology. How do you know what you know? The study of what you think you know. Now I'm going to put you in that area and I'm going to ask you some basic questions. How do you know that you're better qualified than the person who you use your airtime complaining about at school? You, in fact, don't know. You have an opinion, and that's okay too. So this content stuff is not enough. Just because you know maths well, if you don't know how to teach maths well, that's very different than knowing maths well. As a teacher, because you have the content, it doesn't mean you're going to be an effective teacher. You can go to school and learn to be a teacher. That's all good. You have content. What's going to come into question is when you hit that classroom is can you teach it under fire? Can you teach it in a classroom of learners who are belligerent? Can you get them on track? Can you get them to respond appropriately? That's a whole different question.
The source of behavioral change is called cognitive behavioral practices. This concept is based on the practice that action follows thought. What is the professor really saying? Let's find out.
There is an evidence-based way of presenting cognitive behavioral practices that allows you to be very effective, but also requires that you monitor and evaluate your effectiveness. So when we say response to interventions, when we use this language like positive behavioral interventions and responses and response to interventions, what we're really saying to you is no matter what behavior you encounter in a classroom, I don't care what the behavior is, the only appropriate response from a research standpoint is a positive response. Let me back up on this because this might be a little difficult to grasp. The only effective response to behavior of learners is a positive response. If you respond negatively, you escalate the negative behavior. That's what all the research shows. And again, an example, you ever heard like those Scared Straight programs where children are getting in trouble and you try to scare them to make good choices? You take them into a real prison and you show them what real criminals look like and you think that's going to scare them? All the research says that doesn't work. If you as a teacher, let me go all the way to the classroom, if you as a teacher are standing in your classroom and you think just because you're the teacher, your authority is going to scare your children into respecting you, the research says it doesn't work. If you as a parent think that just because you're the parent, that you can force your children to do what you want them to do, here's what the research shows. It might work for a while, but I promise you when you're not around, whatever it is you thought they wouldn't do, they're doing it. So what we know is the only way that you are going to effectively produce substantive, sustained behavioral change is if you change the cognitive aspect of the equation. If you begin to identify how they're thinking. Listen to this. Your hand will never get up, when you wake up in the morning, your hand will never grab you by the mouth, lead you to Dhaka, and make you smoke it. Your hand won't do that. Your hand will, if you as a man and you're married to a woman, your hand will never grab you by the collar in the morning, take you over to your wife and slap her. Your hand will never do that to you. If you slap your wife, guess what? You thought about it. Nothing happens in your life that is not a consequence of your own thoughts and values. So what we say about those children who are acting out, there's thought involved in acting out behavior, inappropriate behavior. Thought is involved. And if you want to change it, you've got to go to the thinking that produces the behavior that you see as a problem in your class or in your school or in your community or in your family as a parent. This is an age-old problem of parents. Your parents did it, so you do it. But your parents did it in the context of a culture and an environment where it worked and it was functional. You can't grow up today. If you try to just beat children, here's what happens. If you just think you can act like, elders in my generation, you weren't even supposed to look them in the eyes. When I was growing up, if a child walked up to an adult and was looking them in the mouth or looking them in the eyes, you'd get slapped. You weren't supposed to do it. Today, if you try to tell a child to hold their head down like that, you know what they'll do? Like, why? You can't make them do it. Here's the point. There's a different cultural context. There's a different dynamic. They have more information about how the rest of the world behaves. You can't keep them uninformed and ignorant anymore. So what you need to do is figure out new ways of addressing old challenges. Corporal punishment does not work. I know there's some of us who want it. We think that we can beat the hell out of a child and make them cooperate. The research doesn't support that. And I'm a research professor. That's my specialty, research. So when people say things, I want to know what research supports it. If you tell me beating your children makes your children act right, what I'm saying is whatever the behavior is that you're beating out of them is just being suppressed. That's all you're doing, you're suppressing it. And eventually that behavior will find its expression because you haven't changed the thinking that produced the behavior in the beginning. And the thing with values in it is values gives you permission to act out.
A very important point to take heed of here is that your children, your learners, will follow your example, your positive and negative behavior. Further on, Professor Osiris gives his opinion on BEE within schools.
Just like BEE isn't working, in your classroom, if you want to be the BEE teacher, it's not going to work. It's not working in your broader society, and it's not going to work in your classroom. You know why? Because you're so busy cursing the darkness, you have forgot how to light the candle. In other words, there's some good you could pull from apartheid, but you're so angry about it, you won't even take the good that was there. You won't even take the good. It was apartheid, 1940s, Fort Hare, that produced the leaders that you now celebrate as the intellectual giants of South Africa, Africa, and the world. You're not producing that kind of intellectual giant today. And we know why. Yes, it's deep and complicated, but guess what? You have some good in your own history, in the soil of your own conflict that you can use in your own interests. But if you do not open yourselves up to that, it's going to be very difficult to get to where you want to go. America, blacks in America, I know you think we're a lot over there, but those of you who haven't been, we're only 13% of the population in America. Blacks that you see, I know you see a lot of us on TV. We're only 13% of America's population. In other words, we're about like the Afrikaner in South Africa. Imagine that. But here's the deal. As bad as that may seem, we produced an African president called Barack Hussein Obama. So the education we had under that oppression did something good.
It is indeed an eye-opening and thought-provoking presentation. If you would like to comment on this broadcast, please contact us on helpdesk@learnextra.co.za or leave a post on our Facebook wall. Cheerio.